Good to see you all here. And thank you all for finding time to come this morning for the talk. A big thank you also to all our participants who are joining us online for this talk. My name is Vishwanath. I work with the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group, and I'll just give a brief about ABCG, and then invite Leo to invite our speakers and head straight up to the talk. But before then, I just want to remind us that on June 5th is the World Environment Day. And so it's also a pleasure for us to gather here today, and it's a day that enables us to bring awareness and action on things that are required to protect our environment. So one interesting thing that I came up when I was looking through the day was that, and the theme for this year is air pollution. So different activities that will affect air pollution, like agriculture, household industry, transport, waste. So what was striking today was that people living next to major traffic areas are up to 12% more likely to be diagnosed with dementia because of the pollution. So as we mark World Environment Day on 5th, it's good to see the measures and actions that we can jointly put together to tackle that. So to my presentation, so the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group is a voluntary coalition of 7 US-based international conservation organizations with extensive field programs in Africa, the Africa Foundation. Okay, so our members include Africa Wildlife Foundation, Conservation International, the Jane Goodall Institute, the Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Society, World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we worked to understand critical biodiversity conservation challenges and their solution in Africa, and to increase our collective conservation impact, because we know that jointly we are stronger, together we are better. We are addressing these 5 areas in our current project implementation areas: land use management, global change impact on diversity, looking at the impacts of climate change on communities and how the way communities are responding is affecting further climate change. Community-based forest management, and looking at global health linkages to conservation, and then here we have the population health and environment section, the freshwater sanitation and hygiene component, gender integration. All these areas are being addressed by ABCG members jointly in different parts of Africa. So we do convene speaker series from time to time, both here in Nairobi and in our offices in DC, and we have participants who join us globally from all over the world. And the aim of our talks is to be able to highlight conservation issues in Africa or globally, promote best practices, tools, and success stories like what we have today here, that we're promoting an innovation that's key to conservation, raise awareness of ABCG, the coalition activities and priority themes, and lastly to be able to convene actors like we are today, to get to know each other, to interact, to learn about what we are doing together, and to develop areas of synergy among conservation actors. So the context is that in all these ABCG members, we have a steering committee member in all the ABCG partner institutions who support to direct the implementation activities and also input into program work and oversee the project implementation by ABCG members in all these organizations. We have the ABCG director, Rebecca Goodman, based in DC at AWF, and myself, I'm based here in Nairobi at the Africa Wildlife Foundation. So I just want to leave us with one line on why we believe that coming together is important. A quote from one of the ABCG members, Kimberly, and she says that the ability to have different institutions coming together to jointly tackle issues and to have a wide geographical reach through members and partners' presence in locations across Africa has contributed to a greater understanding of conservation challenges and their solutions, that a single organization will not be able to realize on their own. And so that's why coming together is so key and crucial to us as ABCG. So with those few introduction lines, I kindly now wish to invite you, who will take us through the main session of today's event and introduce our speakers of today.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I hope everybody can hear me online. If you can't, you can indicate on the computer. So my name is Leo Niskanen, and I'm the Regional Technical Coordinator for IUCN Eastern Southern Africa Regional Office on conservation areas and species. So I coordinate our programs in that domain. So on behalf of IUCN Eastern Southern Africa Regional Office, welcome to this presentation this morning on the local community's first line of defense against illegal wildlife trade initiative. We're going to have two speakers take us through the presentation today. But before I introduce them, just in terms of the questions for these presenters, I would ask you if we could have all the questions at the end of the presentation. Let's run through the presentation and take all the questions at the end. And then those of you who are listening to this online, kindly indicate your question in writing so that we have it there. And in case there's a problem that we can't hear you, we'll be able to read it out. So it will help us when we manage the question and answer session after the presentation. Okay, so let me introduce the speakers. So we have two speakers here today. First of all, we've got Dr. Holly Dublin, who is a senior associate with the International Institute for Environment and Development, but also a senior advisor to the IUCN Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office. And we have also Akshay Vishwanath, who is Senior Program Officer in the Conservation Areas and Species Program for IUCN SRO in this region. So without further ado, I'll invite Holly to start the presentation, and then Akshay will talk later.
Thanks very much, Leo, and good morning all in the room and further afield. We know it's quite early for some of you joining. So I'm going to just be going through to give you a bit of background on where this initiative first began. It won't surprise anyone that's joining the call that some time ago the world became aware again of a poaching crisis, as it's become known, of very high value species in illegal trade. It's not to say it's the first time. Some of us that have gray hairs like me know that even in Kenya in the 1970s and 80s, we had things of a similar magnitude, losing up to from 9,000 rhinos that existed in Tsavo down to 14 individuals. So this is not the first time that we've had these sort of challenges. But there were big responses to it this time around, probably more so than last time. And we became aware that the main response that was being targeted was law enforcement across the entire value chain. Without going into a lot of detail, just to let you know that literally hundreds of millions of dollars have been put in to date on law enforcement. For many of you, you'll know the term of boots on the ground became a very big focus for our donors around the world, which was, we have to get in there and we have to stop this illegal trade. And reducing demand for illegal products also had a sideline of money beginning to flow into behavior change in those consuming countries. And these were the two really big pillars of the response at the beginning. And actually, the group of us that have brought this entire program together noticed that there was something really dramatic missing. And for us, probably the most important piece, which was engaging local communities. And only to say that we came up with these thoughts a very long time ago. This isn't something we just started to think. We started thinking about this as soon as this crisis became known. And what has been more of a surprise for us is how long it has taken to engage others. And I think we're now seeing what the ramifications of not having engaged local communities very, very early on. Because right now, we are seeing the very strong pushback against that heavy law enforcement. And I think that's something that all of us are learning, that perhaps the approach that we're going to describe is a good way forward. So we began this with a thing that we called Beyond Enforcement. And these around there are the partners. For us, Beyond Enforcement just literally meant that. What goes beyond doing that law enforcement? And how do you engage the communities? But over time, from that very first, it started with a workshop actually in South Africa. We had several other workshops around the world, one in Southeast Asia, others in Africa. The group, same group, became very, very interested in, how now can we really begin to look at the local communities? And that was sort of the birth of Flood as we know it. And we then went on to have a project which has been financed by the UK government and the US government, and we're going to talk more about that. But you can see that we began bringing a lot of partners in. This was quite early on. And right now we're talking about going further afield, and we're in direct correspondence now with all of the players that I've just added. But what really were we trying to get at? Well, early on, and this was done from very, very extensive literature review and also these meetings, what was it that was going to make the difference? We call this just our basic equation, that the benefits that are derived from conserving wildlife minus the costs, because there's always a cost in conserving to many, many different entities, but it must be greater than the benefits you get from engaging in that illegal wildlife trade minus the costs of engaging in the illegal wildlife trade. And we also know that the costs have not been all that great, the cost of engaging in it, because law enforcement is not all that strong in many parts of Africa. So to get this equation right, that conservation happens for these highly valuable species, you have to begin to look at more depth of what is involved in trying to get us into a situation where we lean to the left side of this equation. So the group started quite, as I said, a long time ago to try and begin to build the policy necessary for underpinning this engagement of local communities. And many of you will have been involved in different steps along the way, but the very first policy bits we were able to bring in place started in 2013 at the African Elephant Summit in Botswana, and have gone right up until the London Declaration in 2018. This is the second iteration of the London Declaration. And these are all very important policy pieces. So now engaging communities on helping to combat illegal wildlife trade is recognized by the UN General Assembly. This isn't just anyone recognizing things. These are all the countries we work in have signed up to these. And it's very, very important that even in the Sustainable Development Goals, we have direct targets on this. So we feel very confident that the building of the policy platform is strong and it's firm, and most governments that we work with know all about these obligations. The problem is that they haven't known how to start to implement. They don't know where to begin. They haven't known, how do we engage the communities? We know we have to, but how would we do that? And we see that they have engaged in many ways. And that has come probably from rather more of an ignorance about how to engage than a really true theory of how to engage. It's been like, we have to, so let's try to engage. And we see many projects have tried to engage local communities. Some of them have resulted, have used very, very heavy law enforcement tactics, arrests, prosecutions, building prosecutors, catching people in the field, and others have involved discussing with the communities. But none of them have sort of tried to pull it all together and bring that to the heart of the discussion. So this is what gave us the view that there really was a need for a new methodology and tools to accompany it. And we chose to use what's known as action research, which allowed us to bring together the people implementing projects with the communities, rather than having these things go somehow in silos. And deeply interrogating theories of change and key assumptions. We'll be talking to you more about that. But this isn't just jargon. This is about the fact that we all have implicit theories of change. But what we've discovered through this tool is when it's not explicit, you may think you're agreeing with someone else, but actually it might be quite divergent from their views. And that has been important, because what it's also highlighted is that sometimes the theories of change of implementers and donors are actually quite flawed. And they're actually sometimes rather naive about how the communities actually view these things. So the divergence from what you can conceptually think of as a project, designing a project, compared to what exists on the ground and the reality of where you're trying to do this project can be wildly different. And this is being, comes out through the use of the methodology. And so we see what the strength of finding a new methodology and building tools around that have been. Primarily, we think it very much empowers the communities and strengthens that collaboration. So the communities finally feel that they have a voice before somebody's doing something and bringing something and asking them to do something and behave in a certain way. They have voiced their own view of how that interface is to occur. And when it's done properly, you see that the trust builds quite rapidly. And you're not getting into a situation of us and them, or, you know, the donors want this and the communities want that. It's more collaboratively brought together. And the hope, of course, is that it helps to design more effective interventions. And that if you have an intervention already going, that maybe upon hearing and engaging with the communities about their own views of how these things work, that there can be room to make adjustments in an adaptive way. So I'll turn over to Akshay now.
Don't worry about the big details in this particular slide. It's just to show you that there is quite a lot of detail that goes into what we delve into in the flood methodology and the process. What you just need to understand here really is that we interrogate assumptions at multiple levels in our baseline theory of change. Now, this baseline theory of change was essentially developed after a review of all the different initiatives to combat illegal wildlife trade from across the world, and Ollie mentioned this in one of her earlier slides. Based on that review, we essentially understood that all the interventions, or parts of those interventions, the activities fall under 4 distinct categories, and I'll go into that in just a while. But also understanding that there are different levels at which those activities and impacts operate. So you have enabling actions that are required. These are all on the left hand of the slide. You have your actions, your results, your pathway outcomes, cross-cutting outcomes, overall outcomes, and at the very top, you have your long-term impacts. So essentially, when we talk about our theory of change, we're operating across that whole spectrum, trying to understand what are the assumptions that lead from one level to the other, and then questioning that. I'll describe that in a bit more detail just shortly. So as I said, there are 4 main pathways, 4 main categories under which many of those activities fall under. So the first is increasing the cost of participating in illegal wildlife trade. So, you know, the law enforcement, prosecutions, etc., community scouts, rangers, all of that fall under there. The second pathway is increasing incentives for stewardship. So what are the benefits, for example, from ecotourism, from access to natural resources, governance, all of that sort of falls there, those incentives. The next pathway, pathway C, is decreasing the cost of living with wildlife, and that's essentially about managing human-wildlife conflict. So as we all know, communities living nearby or with wildlife incur huge costs through human-wildlife conflict, and a lot of interventions tackling illegal wildlife trade deal with that. And then finally, there's increasing non-wildlife-based livelihoods. So these are livelihoods not related to wildlife necessarily. So it could be industry, small-scale business, etc., that are set up in communities to help them improve their livelihoods, increase their incomes, etc. And obviously, a lot of activities are seen in illegal wildlife trade interventions. A lot of activities seem to focus on this as well. So this slide, we're just basically saying that what we're trying to do with flood is question each of the assumptions that underpin all these activities and the different levels of the theories of change that they operate in. So for example, under pathway A, when we talk of increasing of costs of participating in IWT, for one common activity is training community scouts. The assumption there is, of course, community scouts will work with law enforcement. They'll help collect evidence or intelligence, etc., and work with law enforcement to bring about, you know, the kind of impacts we're looking for. So that's the assumption. What we've found with flood, for example, is that in many cases communities might say, it's great you're training community scouts, but they're actually working with the poachers and not with your law enforcement. So what we're trying to do with this is try to highlight, shed light on those assumptions and cross-check whether they're actually true. So as a designer of an intervention, you might have a certain view, a certain perception, a certain assumption about how this would operate in the real world. We're testing that with communities and seeing whether that's actually the case. Another example might be with Pathway D, increasing non-wildlife based livelihoods, creating alternative incomes. Again, the assumption would be if you create a legal income stream, community members would move away from an illegal income stream, which might be seen as risky or taboo, etc. But you could ask communities about this and they'll say, well, we just do both because we earn more money that way. Again, highlighting where there might be discrepancies between what the assumptions of the designers of these interventions are and what actually happens on the ground. The idea again is to basically highlight where your interventions are actually working, where they are aligned with communities, and where there's misalignment, there's divergence on those issues, and therefore investments in those sorts of activities may not yield the results that you want. So I showed you earlier the detailed baseline theory of change, the first slide that I started speaking about. So we start at that point. Then we have a process in which we engage with the developers or the designers of the interventions, and we develop their theory of change. So what's their worldview? What are their assumptions? What are their activities? And we then develop their theory of change. Through another set of processes with the community, focus group discussions, interviews, etc., we then develop the community theory of change. So building on the designer's theory of change, we have the community theory of change, and these are then comparable. So we go back and have a discussion with both the community and the designers and say, look, this is your theory of change as the designers, this is your theory of change as the community, and we compare them and say, again, where are the areas of alignment, where are the areas of divergence, what underpins those divergences, or what underpins those synergies, and have a conversation about that so we can understand what is the best way going forward. So as I said, a lot of processes with communities, focus group discussions using tools and activities and methodologies that are easy, fun, interactive, so that it's not something that perhaps is more advantageous to the more literate members of society, etc. The way we've designed our tools and methodologies allow us to interrogate and engage with community members of all different backgrounds. Once we've collected all their inputs and have it put together, we sort of play it back to them. So you can see it in some of these photos there. We're showing some of the results, both in sort of more graphically represented methods, but sometimes written as well. But what we do is, as we're replaying these back to them, we give them a chance to reflect back on it, to validate it, to speak about what we've captured, but also we give them a chance to prioritize. So, for example, under the different pathways and the different activities, in the context of illegal wildlife trade, we give them the opportunity to sort of prioritize what they feel is more important, what would be required in their community to focus on to combat that illegal wildlife trade. Again, as I said in the previous slides, once we have both the community theory of change and designer theory of change, we're able to have discussions with both groups of stakeholders to discuss where do they have those synergies and divergence and how we can address those. And then this finally is one example of an output that we got from this Kilotome, Olderkesi Conservancy in Kenya, where you can see there's a lot of what we've highlighted in yellow there shows the big differences between what was in our baseline theory of change and that what finally came out from the community theory of change. And you can see even right at the very top, at the impact level, there's significant difference. So as a designer, they might be thinking about just reducing illegal wildlife trade, but the community, that's the bigger picture is functioning and intact natural ecosystems. So for them, illegal wildlife trade is just a small component of that larger issue. You could see right down from enabling actions at the intervention level, at the output level, lots of changes there. You can also see under pathway C, which is the whole column is in a different color, it's actually of less importance there compared to the other pathways as far as the community is concerned. So they put more importance on, for example, pathway B, incentivizing stewardship, compared to pathway C and A, for example. So this is in a very summarized way, some of the outputs we can see. Holly will go into a bit more detail about that just now. Oh, sorry, there's one more slide for me. What we have done with all the work that we've done is we've published the methodology, so it's available as a set of tools and guidelines, and this is available on the website, which we'll show you a bit later. So that's definitely there. We also have, as we said, designed very many innovative tools and sort of interactive games we can use with the communities through the flood methodology to, again, make sure we're not disadvantaging anyone who's, for example, not literate. In the different focus groups, ensuring those who may otherwise feel marginalized in discussions can come out with their views, etc. So that's all part of that, and it's something that helps them also capture what we're bringing out through the methodology. So as a community, they're very aware of what's coming out and what's being documented. So that's all part of it. From the more formal side, as you can see with the tables and the charts, we're able to capture the differences of opinions, the divergent views, etc., that we're getting from both the designers and the community in a way that we can present it back when we're documenting all the learnings.
Right, so as we said from the start, in designing a new methodology and a set of tools, we've been incredibly rigorous about doing it through process and learning while we're doing it, so that it has become this iterative process that we think has been what has strengthened it, actually. Taking it out there, discussing it with many different people, getting their feedback, getting the pluses and minuses and what things made sense and what things were just too difficult. And we have our own little set of principles that we continue to develop because we really believe it's fundamental that we understand what principles you would use. It's not just something to slap on people. You have to be able to be quite grounded in it. So one of the first things that we feel has been very important is the independence of the facilitation process. While all of us work in conservation organizations and have our entire career, we've really learned through this that, you know, in Africa, when your partners are trying to be your partners, sometimes it's difficult for them to say difficult things to you. And sometimes they just won't do it because it's not really the culture to do that in a very overt way. Yet we've found absolutely no problem when we've gone in and said, we're not planning on implementing here, we're not implementers, you have other implementers you're working with, but we just want to hear your voice and do it in a very safe way so that people are not exposed, so it doesn't cause hostility or anything like that. It's been super important to the process. That's not to say that it has to be a group of highly trained people, but it has to be someone that's perceived by the community to be independent. There has to be an implementing partner that is either on the ground already or is planning an intervention, because there could be nothing more frustrating for a community than to be put through an exercise only to say, and now what happens? You know, why are you, our communities that we all work with, we know they have tremendous fatigue from being people doing, PRAs with them, people coming back to do all kinds of, they want to know what's going to happen. So we've learned that it's one of our criteria for going in is someone going to be there to be with them as this information comes out. So that's an important part. The iterative validation, which Akshay went over, we can't even say that strongly enough. That is happening during the methodology at every step, in every session you're in, so that by the end of it, they are completely united in their ownership of it. In other words, you're not like going away somewhere and then having a meeting somewhere else and coming back. You're just feeding it back to them right then and there. And if you didn't get something right, you bring it back the next day to discuss. Do we have this correct? Because that helps you to, when you feed it back, people feel rather a lot of ownership, which is I said that, or I was the person, or we did that in our group. And so it starts to build that ownership, which of course that transfer of the ownership and the accountability as well. Not just we have a theory, but if it worked this way and if someone intervened with us, we would take accountability for it. But if they're going to do it the way they want to do it, we take no accountability because we didn't say it works that way. So it's been very interesting to see that. We think it's a core principle that ownership begins. And of course, the adaptive management principles, which is the whole thing about the subsequent interventions, that you come back, that you meet with that implementer or with the donors and have that discussion to show clearly where there is a divergence of opinion and then allow the iteration. We're feeling quite strongly that if it's not heard, in other words, the communities say it and it's deliberately not heard, you're going to have problems down the line. Because now you've actually asked their opinion on this, and now they've really expressed it and articulated, and now you've really checked that you got it right. And if you do something quite divergent, there's probably going to be issues. So, you know, it's a very empowering tool, that's what we've learned, but we think that that's its strength. So, like all good things that we do in the conservation world, we've tried to be very deliberate on the learning. Like, where have we been? Where are we going? What is the direction? And this has been something kind of important for us, that, you know, everyone talks about their successes. You know, we also had donor money. You want to talk about your successes. And yet the bits that didn't work are probably 10 times more important than the bits that did work, because they're telling you really what you have to change, as opposed to, yes, I feel good because I got it right. And so we've really seriously taken that to heart. We have many consultations with our partners and among ourselves as to what are we learning. But what we know about learning is that, you know, there's big differences between failure and success. One of them is just that you have the fortitude to keep going. And believe me, this has been hard, because a lot of this has been done through voluntary effort that, as you know, IUCN has its ability to get. But it's hard to keep getting people to just put in that time. And we know that the pathway is not just a straight arrow. You go from here and then you have success there. So that whole thing that bridges the difference between failure and success is the learning part. And I think we've been very, very deliberate on the learning part, so that we're not putting a methodology out there that we feel people will run into big problems with. In fact, we're trying to learn the lessons before it gets painful for others. So many people have asked us, okay, you do this with the communities and you interact with them, you hear their magnificent voices, which we have heard and so come to love, all of us. But what difference does it make? Why are you doing this? This is the #1 question from the donors. So what? That you now know what the community thinks. And, you know, it's been a little bit of a surprise for us that it's been such a hard thing. But we feel that it really, really has brought us some things that we probably would not have gotten otherwise, and that no one else is getting because they're not taking the time to do this type of methodology. And that is that, you know, hearing those voices has been absolutely critical, because it makes it made in Africa. It makes it different than the way most communities have experienced the donor world and the NGO world, and coming in to save and coming in to do something, when they're just sort of saying, well, yeah, somebody was here yesterday, but let's be polite and not tell them that, you know, one of the other competitive partners was here. So a lot of truth comes out in this that's very, very good. And there we can see one of our stars who's in the room, Dixon, that, you know, we've been able to take these messages to really major places. This is Dixon, you know, who not only spoke, but chaired and moderated a panel at the London Declaration, right? To bring those community voices on through. And where do we get those lessons from? From the listening, from the learning, from the iteration. But importantly, and this is something that, you know, our donors are always asking, what will happen because of it? Well, things have happened in the places that we've gone to, and I just thought it would be useful to share a few. So we've had changes in enabling actions at the bottom. These come sort of directly from we worked in 3 communities here in Kenya that we may not have said, 3 Maasai communities, very different to one another in different parts, all along the Tanzanian border with Kenya, starting in the Mara, and then Sorolo, Shompole El-Keramatian, and then Kilitome near Amboseli. And the voices are different. So what's happened? Well, we were told that it really has helped with the demystification of the expert mentality, that has become kind of like a common way for people to understand, oh, that's what they're trying to do, as opposed to being something enforced. The opportunity to use this framework for broader community planning processes, all 3 of our partners are doing that. That's not what we brought it in for, but when asked, could it be used for that? It's like, yeah, why not? And we're ourselves doing that. The democratization of community voice. This very much brings in women and youth in ways that they are not normally brought in. So they are not subordinated. They are just worked with, you know, in a parallel way, and then their truth is brought together with the truth of everyone else in the community, and that is done in a sort of safe and guarded way. And assisting the communities, you know, with understanding about fund distribution. This is one of the things we came into, that there was hostility among the youth because they didn't understand where does all this money go through for that we get? And they had never, that was their feeling. They told us, we don't know where the money is going. So we brought it into the overall discussion with their parents, basically. The parents were kind of mortified at first and said, well, how do you think your bursaries are being paid? And the kids were just completely, they had no idea. And they said, oh, you mean us being in school? That's how it's coming from these wildlife things. And so the parents were a bit aggravated. And then they came together and said, well, we should do the distribution when you guys are at home on holiday. Then it will be transparent. You can see that happening. So those kinds of discussions, have come back to us as having been very useful to open that up. At the pathway A level of the increasing the disincentives basically to poach, there's the social norms part. Akshay mentioned about the stronger sort of law enforcement, state-led or community-led, but also the social norms. And that's come back to us that in places where they weren't really overtly using the social norms, they actually wanted to enhance them because the young people still believed in them, but their parents thought they didn't. And that comes out in the dialogue, that the kids still really believe in these social norms. But also we've had reports of lower poaching levels in the places. One of them has had no poaching whatsoever. They've gotten additional rangers to effectively help by discussing with their donors that they've been through this process. They've had the communities engaging others in the community to discourage traditional killings. So that's more been around lions, right? Like these are the reasons not to. On pathway B, which is about both financial and non-financial benefits, right? It's not just about getting money. And these communities are strong on that. They feel that they get forced many times to talk about money. And yet for them, there are other things that are not money that are just as important about that wildlife that's being poached. And yet everybody's always in there thinking all they want to get is financial benefits. So we had a very wonderful talk, a very difficult one with one of our communities where they said to us, we love the implementer that we work with. It's a private sector implementer, but we think that they need another operator here because they can't make enough money to bring us the benefits. And that's a hard thing to say to somebody that has exclusive rights in an area. But this went straight back to them in the dialogue, and now they've brought in 2 new operators. The communities are elated. It's like something more for them. And it all came through these discussions. Pathway C, on the reducing the human-wildlife conflict or separating humans and wildlife, we've had consolation payments have been increased. As you know, in Kenya, there's a lot of issues around compensation that I won't go into, but we do have some of the NGOs that are involved in these consolation payments, which are not direct payments for the losses. There are a number of them functioning right now. The communities, in one case, has moved inside of the electric fence, a particular place where they were getting hammered. So realizing that the electric fence was there, that they could move into that and not just be complaining or wanting to kill elephants. So that came from the discussions. And much quicker responses to incidents that community members make, and that in some places they've had, rocky relations with KWS. And we've brought KWS into these discussions so that they can hear those things and not get angry with the community, but hear what would be wanted. We have other examples where the community loves KWS and they work as a team together. They feel that there's been, a bit more like personal touch, that when people are injured that they get visited instead of, the most common thing that we heard across all communities was in this country, in Kenya, that when a rhino or an elephant is killed, the very first thing that happens is the choppers come in and the planes come in and the guys in uniforms come in. But when a human is killed, they never hear from anyone. And we heard that without exception in quite emotional ways. And then on pathway D, the non-wildlife based incomes, as Akshay said, we're deliberate in not calling them alternative livelihoods. But what we do find is that for most donors, this is where the majority of the money is going. And they do call it alternative livelihoods, and they do believe in their theory of change, that if that livelihood comes, it will displace anyone being involved. We haven't seen that in a single occasion, and I don't think any of us would think in our own lives that we would ever do such a thing as to say, oh, that's okay. I don't have to make more money. I can just, replace this with that. So for that, it's been more authenticated for us. So just to move on and to bring to the closure the talk, we had a lot of people telling us, this is all theory, it's very theoretical, it's so conceptual, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but we've been doing it on the ground. So for us, it's not theory. We have all these publications now. We have been to these communities. We're talking with new communities. We're scoping new places. And we are able to make these things available, which, we're seeing there's great uptake on them now. So everything we're talking about here, we've done these case studies. Everything that we've spoken about is available now. And we think that's, we're IUCN and IIED. So sharing of knowledge is very important for us. Then, as I started at the beginning, this is a tool. It's a methodology with a bunch of tools. And we need tools. We need parts of different things, a spanner for one thing and a hammer for another thing. And so we've seen that flood is fitting quite neatly in with other tools that are being used with communities. So, for example, the one on social assessment called SAPA, the one on governance assessments called GAPA, and many different tools that are being used on management effective assessments. And we see that flood slots in there very nicely. It has overlap with all the other three areas, but it's more about the ecological outcomes. It's about what are we trying to do for these species that are under pressure from the illegal trade. Having said that, we're seeing more and more that flood, just the methodology, is pretty strong around any community-based natural resource management. It doesn't have to be around illegal trade, because in most places you still need the law enforcement to some degree, and people would be communities would be the first to say that. So working with our partners, IIED and SULI, we have put together this website, which is called People Not Poaching. And the website is now gathering through a sort of structured way the lessons that are being learned. So our lessons going in there, but lots and lots of lessons going in there from all over the world. And we're getting really great feedback about how useful this is going to be as a tool. And of course, we're sort of all the same people behind all of this, so we're making sure that we tie things together. We've been pretty excited by recent events. We were at 2 in the last month, and this was the most recent one, which was just last Friday, where President Masisi, he was in Las Vegas, President Masisi from Botswana, and this was a direct quote from his talk, that local communities are the first line of defense in the protection of our elephants. So we feel pretty proud of that. We've been trying to get messages through to a lot of people at very high levels, and we think that, they're finally maybe feeling that this methodology provides some way for them to meet those policy commitments. And I'll end on that. So we think that we're just in the right place now for the rollout to really start beginning. We're getting lots of requests from different countries that have interest in it, and we invite all of you to join us. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Holly and Akshay. We're a little bit behind on schedule, so I think we'll need to probably keep this question and answer session within about 15 minutes or so, because we will also still have another colleague say a few words at the end. So let's try and keep it within those time limits. I've got questions online here, and then of course people in the room. Okay, so I see a question here from Mark Gerard, and the question is, do you carry out training with facilitators of how to use the toolkits, and what level of expertise does a facilitator need to have to successfully use these tools? Want
me to take that?
Sure,
Yeah.
Holly, yeah.
So that's a great question. And we're right now getting into that very specific thing. So we're going to be developing a more formalized training module for this, and it will start with the training of facilitators, and then the training of those facilitators to roll out the methodology. And we think that's really important. I think generally as a team, we believe that the methodology is not all that complicated. So once one learns how to do that interface, it's a tool. It's like any other tool that you can learn to use. We feel, because we have done this at pretty basic level, we do feel that now that we have the method a lot more nailed down, remember we had to design it, that it would be actually quite easy for a person that's often facilitating in the community around anything, that level of person. They should be able to handle it. The trickiest bit is pulling the theories of change together, is being able to turn the input that you get back into a theory of change. And that probably definitely requires literacy, I would say, that particular part of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, I don't see any hands up in the room yet, so I'll take the second question here. That's from Dina. How do you involve local government authorities in your approaches?
I'll take that.
Do you want to?
Yeah. So I think, again, because when you roll out flood, it's very context specific. So the role of your local government in that particular context is what you have to take cognizance of and then use that in your approach. So in some cases, your local government might be the designer of those interventions. And in that case, you'd be using them, developing your first round of theory of change for the designer. That's one way. But in some cases, they might just be sort of part of the communities in terms of decision making, etc. You might involve them as some of the stakeholders in your community focus group discussions, or etc. The other option is as key informant interviews. So as we're doing this process, and there's more detail about this in the guidance for the methodology, you need to have key informant interviews because you need to triangulate your information. So it's not just designer versus communities, but you have other key informants who can give you insights into some of these issues, which then help you develop your theory of change. So really, I would say involving local government authorities, actually any stakeholder in when you roll out flood, is really context specific. And at the very beginning of the process, you do some scoping visits, some orientation visits to get a sense of who those stakeholders are in that particular setup. And how you can then plan on how to involve them as you roll out the methodology.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add that we kind of look at them in categories. Do they have influence? Do they have authority? Or do they have information? And those are, as we work with the community to decide who those people are, they're going to fall into one of those categories. So I think it covers local government in every case it has. But as Akshay says, all the other stakeholders as well.
Charles?
Well, thank you. My name is Charles, for those who are online. I'm the regional program coordinator for IUCN. My question is all around the classical dilemma that has been happening with the framework tools, for example, flood here. In fact, last week we had a big discussion around evaluating something on an adaptation tool, saying projects never fail, projects never scale. And one of the fundamental deficiencies was about the mainstreaming of these magnificent tools at the policy decision-making level of the governments, who in Africa end up the custodians of these resources. So having listened to the presentation, what is sort of the future plan to try and integrate this and making sort of a guideline framework for helping governments use this in decision-making? It's just as well as we NGOs can do our part in testing, incubating the models, but the scale-up and long-term adaptation will be when the governments own it and it becomes part of their decision-making and investment plan. That's sort of my complicated question.
I think we know.
Do you want to react to that? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So as you know from the beginning, we're kind of policy hounds that really love what really goes on the ground. So we've been thinking about that sort of all the way through and trying to find all of these ways to bring these messages back, right? And we've done that pretty successfully. That's why the policy probably has continued to spin, right? Because we've been bringing messages back. But also we now have in mind, we've just been asked, for example, by the CASA Secretariat, which is the coordinating group for the 5 countries in Southern Africa that share that big piece of land. The CASA Secretariat has just invited us to do a training for their governments, solely for the governments. So we're getting those kinds of things, repeatedly, like both at a regional level and at the individual country level. So we're hoping, Charles, to be able to, we're going to be we talked about it this morning, to be getting more opportunity to bring that together in terms of the tool, but much more importantly, in terms of the dialogue, like how to help the dialogue take place from an evidence base as opposed to from an emotive base. And we think that this tool helps to do that. but getting those dialogues, and so that's kind of our idea, is to start those dialogues both at regional level and at national level, and, you know, for us, anywhere, even at the local government level.
Right. So yeah, we had Chris there. Can you introduce yourself as well and speak up, please, so that everybody can hear?
I'll try to speak up. So my name is Chris. I work for the Global Grounds Initiative. My question is kind of looking towards what you invest into the tool. So, for example, if you, I mean, many tools, we know one of the things that plagues them is that they become very costly very quickly. So, with this tool, do you have indicated costs for it? If you were supposed to include it in the program or project as part of the process?
So basically through our piloting of this initiative thus far, I think we can just say, sort of in broad brush strokes, you know, of course it changes depending on the logistics on the ground, etc. One rollout in one community. So for us, when we say one community, is if, for example, if you have a conservancy, all the members of that conservancy would be that one community you're doing it in. You could say it's roughly about $70,000. But having said that, remember this is very specific to the context. So if it's an area with, you know, easy transport, easy to get communities together in one place to do focus group, those costs reduce significantly. However, at this stage, because it's been the piloting stage and we've just done a few rollouts, we're dependent on a smaller team of people. But as Holly mentioned, you know, we're now in a stage where we're trying to train others in how to use it, get more partners on board. So obviously, with more expertise available and you know, at different levels, from sort of national level umbrella bodies or other NGO partners who are able to do this, we foresee those costs going down even further. So you don't need to, for example, fly someone from Kenya to Zambia to do a flood rollout there. You'd have people in Zambia who could already do it, and that would reduce costs even further. But yeah, so I think the more we scale this out, the more we train others to do it, the more we develop a community of practice on this, I think it's going to get much more cheaper to do. And particularly, I think if this forms part of the a program or project development process, I think the costs come down even further, because you're not really thinking about an exclusive team to do flood, but your program team who's developing a 10-year initiative or 5-year initiative are the people who can work with facilitators and get this process done. Again, that further reduces the costs.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I mean, I do think that, yeah, as Akshay is saying, you know, the aim is to really bring this methodology very accessible. And, you know, it's not, like Holly said, it's not really that, it's not rocket science. And I think, you know, training community support organizations, people on the ground to use this methodology would mean that there isn't this reliance on technical experts or consultants or anything like that. So we really envisage that this is a key priority to make it not just accessible and user-friendly, but also affordable and practical, because otherwise it will not be used, and it will just be another tool that is, yeah, nice to have, but that's what we want to get away from. So it's a very important point. Thanks, Chris, for raising it. I know we had a hand up here from Coleman, but I'll just take maybe one, just to go between people in the room and people who are writing questions here, so that I don't lose track here. We've got another one from Dina here. How do you use the existing community informants on IWT who are anonymously recruited by law enforcement and/or intelligence services? I'm not sure.
Key informant interviews. Key informant interviews. If they come up, they may not be identified, but for us, they don't need to be identified. I mean, we don't need to identify them to anyone. They would just be people that are being interviewed, and we've already had that.
And obviously this is very sensitive, so we're very well aware that these are sensitive issues, and you got to be really careful that you don't identify or attribute some comment that came from somewhere to any one individual, just to make sure that we always protect the source of the information. That's very clear in the guidance.
We've also found, by the way, that some of those intelligence people are not working either for government or intelligence agents, but for NGOs.
Correct.
And that, you know, we see why that is getting stresses and strains around it.
Correct.
You know, when maybe even the law enforcement agency is not aware of that.
Exactly. Coleman, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Coleman O'Brien, and I'm the Global Policy Manager for Wildlife in WWF International. So thanks for the great presentations. Just two questions, they're both kind of two sides of the same coin. First of all, you did mention kind of triangulation interviews and that, because there must occasionally be instances where the theory of change that emerges from the consultation doesn't necessarily gel with a sort of a consensus theory of change of the wider expert community. And the second question is, to what extent do you find communities are divided? I mean, there's an implicit assumption that you get a unified message, but I'm sure that's never the case.
What's it you want to go on?
So I think on the first question, part of how the guidance and the methodology is structured is that it allows us to capture those nuances as the discussions are happening, whether it's with the designers or with the community focus groups, the different community focus groups. So yes, we do collect information at sort of, that community level, but certainly through the process we capture all the nuances, and that often guides and informs our thinking as we put together the theory of change. When we come out with other insights, we're saying, yes, this might be attributable to that. So yes, that's definitely part of the process, and that's captured in sort of the case study documents that we come out with. On the second part, yes, definitely. There's, in those discussions, there's a lot of, differences of opinion, etc. Part of why we talked about, coming back once we've captured everything and validating the community. One is to just say, did we capture those differences correctly? Because maybe we didn't. Or if there was consensus, did we capture it correctly? But also it gives the people we're working with, whether it's in the community focus group discussions or with the designers, it gives the chance to discuss those differences and say, is this a fundamental difference of opinion and we capture it as such? Or is there a difference of opinion because there was some misunderstanding somewhere? For example, Holly mentioned the issue about bursaries coming out of benefits from wildlife, where the youth were saying there's absolutely no benefit, only simply because they just didn't know that the money educating them came from that. So in those discussions, you can then come to a common understanding simply because one group of people had either different understanding, which has now been rectified, or they didn't have the information. So yes, it's all that.
I would say that if anything, if we could generalize, and we're cautious not to generalize too much, but the discussions we've had with women have been mind-boggling and have been very informative to all of the donor implementer, because that's not normally the voice that's heard. And we've been very surprised by how many strong thoughts they have had. And so those often come out as the differences. So one can discuss that because it comes straight out as a different thought. But even in so much as when we were looking at alternative livelihoods, in inverted commas, non-wildlife based livelihoods, in going to one community where the implementer said, the only thing they have here are things around pastoralism. So, selling of milk or whatever. So when we were with the women, we just said, we're just going to have a clean flip chart. And then we're just going to put up anything that you do. And 3 sheets later, these are all the things that the women were doing for their livelihoods. Apparently not obvious to the people they were working with. So, some major things can come out. We haven't had, I don't think, any case where it's just so irreconcilable, but it can be things that help you understand why things are not working the way you might have thought.
Okay, well, I'm going to take this next one from Shira. Do you have a specific geographic areas you specialize in, considering much of your work and approach to communities with big culture dependence?
For us, actually, we're trying to look for as many geographies as possible to roll out floods, just so that as we develop the community of practice around this, we can actually say that these are, the different context-specific situations that either aid the fight against IWT or hinder it, etc. What are the differences in incentives, disincentives, cultural taboos, all of that. So we're actually looking to, as we scale up this work and train more people, to spread to as many geographic areas as possible. So no, we're not restricted on that.
I think the one place where we found a limitation, and because we're so much putting our energy into getting this expanded, we haven't delved deeply into it yet. But in areas that have big peri-urban populations, where we're talking about potentially 1 million or more people. You know, in other words, it's a city. This hasn't been designed with that in mind. Some of the social scientists we've spoken to are like, yeah, of course that can be done, but it's a much bigger, because you have to segment the communities and then segment them again and then segment them again. And so it just becomes a very major consultation process. But it would be fair to say that particularly in some other parts of the continent, that's what they desperately need, because the poaching is coming out of those peri-urban communities.
Correct. I don't see any other hands here, so there's one from Dina here. Does the community involvement component include transboundary IWT threats? And how does the methodology and tool explain direct on threats that involve communities bordering protected areas and reserves, crossing 2 different countries? For example, communities in the Serengeti border for Tanzanian communities and the Kenyan communities. So, very good question.
Well, we've already had that experience. Do you want to go or I'll go?
Yeah.
So we're very interested in transboundary, super interested, and we're actually looking for the opportunity to do some transboundary work. We have one coming up in that Kaza area, we hope, in Southern Africa. But one of the very important things here is that in those assumptions we told you about, and if you look at the guidance, you'll see they're articulated out. I mean, these are statements. They're not like in your head, the assumptions. And those assumptions for transboundary populations become very important. So you're asking about external players, and now you're maybe asking about players that are on the other side of the border, either in the law enforcement side or in the community side. What are the relationships between those 2 communities? Sometimes they're close and sometimes they're not. So we pick it up in the assumptions, but we really want to try in some transboundary areas to have a program that really embraces the transboundary nature and see if it can feed back and forth within the methodology.
Yeah, and particularly also because of, as we know, the policies and laws can be radically different across the border, and those are the enabling conditions for this sort of thing. We need to really look at that.
So an example for the question, so we're looking at that area where the policies are very different, like in that Mara area. So on the Tanzania side, the Loliondo area, and on the Kenyan side, the Mara and its extended conservancies. And we're trying to see whether we can get something going right there, because we think that's a really important area. But likewise, all the communities that we've worked in already.
Great. Is there anyone else who wants to add anything?
Maybe.
Dixon, yeah?
Maybe I can just add a comment, having been part of the team that participated in the work on the ground. I think really what was very valuable for me was the ability of the tool and the methodology to create, first of all, an open, transparent space where people feel like they can discuss their own issues, because it's quite segmented in the way you approach community, and also how it structures the way people provide feedback. And even as we went along, people quickly, when we started introducing the topic, people thought they had all the answers. And the more we went into the discussion, the more they started saying, oh, I didn't think about that. Well, thank you for reminding me about that. And so it really creates the ability for people to talk over a long time in a very structured way, and eventually all of them becoming more understanding of the issues, and even some of the issues that they often taken as assumptions or have taken for granted really came into the table and became something that they want to participate in. And I think in a number of the places we went in, we actually ended up with people saying, even outside of this exercise, we want to go and undertake these particular activities because we think they are now much important. I think also relevant to the question that was raised about how to you engage the policymakers, and for me, I think using entry points as a route is really important. For us as an organization, and did some kind of, I didn't say that, from the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, we even had to rethink our theory of change. And one of the things that came out was the fact that we had never spent enough time to think about disincentives. So we often focus on incentives. Through this methodology, we also started asking, what are the disincentives? And these are things that were hearing sort of, but we never paid a lot of attention. And actually, to some of our conservancy members, they were more worried about the disincentives
that even additional incentives. And so, and I think this was really important. And even more recently, having had a discussion with the cabinet secretary, we raised the issue of incentives themselves as an important aspect of conserving wildlife in community and private areas. And because the issue was relevant at the time and in the meeting that we were, it did then point back to us and say, can you bring to us to better understanding on what incentives there are needed or there exist that could spur more and more people getting interested. So I think that once you understand the issues and you understand the methodology and the outcomes of the dialogue, often you can get into the policy discourse and pick certain things that the policymakers may not adopt the entire document and say this is now the official way of government of doing things. But if you can link that with the issue at hand that the policymakers are interested in, and then you can just inject that particular part of the theory of change into that discussion, I think you can actually begin to see policymakers getting more involved and adopting the methodology.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Dixon. Did you, Charles, want to say something still?
I think Dixon responded.
Dixon's,
but however, in terms of looking now into the future, how are we able to use the tool to provide for evidence of impact? Impact to that last line, illegal wildlife trade or whatever it is, community conservation. Does the tool have the right ingredients that at the end of the day we can both qualitatively and quantitatively, say, because of using this tool, there's been fundamental mindset shift, attitude, and practices that are practically reducing that, land degradation or, bushmeat or all those. Did it reach that level in terms of, or do we envision it getting to that level of helping influence the evidence-based outcomes?
Well, the things that I was reading to you are explicit outcomes, right? And that's within like less than a year of them actually engaging in it. I think that one of the reasons we want to find the partners who are implementers is because we're not implementers. So that impact is a time sensitive thing. And so that's why we're saying don't take it into a place where you don't have somebody that can be in there. But we would think that if you built this into your project, you would be setting up those indicators so that as your project is rolling out, you are seeing whether you're having outcomes or impacts. And clearly that's critical. So for us, this becomes anecdotal just because because people said, so what? So we went back to our partners and said, so what? So what happened? And they gave us those. But I think if you had a partner on the ground that was implementing, that they would be collecting that information, right? And they would be the ones to say, did this project go correctly? I think what we've tried to say to communities also is, once you own this and have accountability, if something changes and you don't believe in the bits that you said, because nobody's putting this on you, this is your own view, you have to iterate, right? So you have to iterate with your partner and say, that's not true anymore. But at some stage, you have to take accountability. You have to say, we said it happens that way. And if you're given finances or technical support or whatever, and it turns out it's radically different, you have to be able to learn that. So we believe, Charles, that that's really important, of course.
Right, so I'm just conscious of time. I know some people have to leave as well, so I think we're going to have to wrap up this presentation. Maybe just a couple of last final words from me, and building on what Holly was saying about partnerships. So, this is something that we really would encourage, people in this room, people listening, others. We really are looking to roll this out in other contexts, other places, with donors. How do we design better projects, not just look at projects that are already on the ground? How do we do a better job at linking with policy? There's great opportunity we feel for this tool, and also in not just illegal wildlife trade. I think this whole framework of questioning your assumptions. What are we doing here? Is it really being constructive about these things? I think this framework can really have an important role in that. So we would really encourage us. So at least one promising comment someone put up already about being interested in talking more about how. So that's what we're really looking forward to. Don't hesitate to contact us anytime. We're here for more information. There is that website that Holly showed, but you need any more information, please let us know. It is a complicated topic. We can't cover everything this time, but thank you very much. I believe we're a bit behind schedule, but I think there's a plan to still have just a quick word from our communications team.
Yes.
Okay, well, I will invite Caroline Niamunu, who's our regional communications and constituency officer, just quickly to say a few things, and then we will break, and there's tea and snacks available after that for those who want to stay on. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you very much. I will just take 2 minutes of your time. And my name is Caroline, just like Leo introduced me. And speaking about partnerships in the room and speaking about the initiative that we have just talked about, I think it's important to realize that when we work together, we are actually able to achieve more. So talking about that, I just wanted us to quickly talk about IUCN membership and what that means and why would you benefit from becoming IUCN members. I know we already have IUCN members in the room, but just to think about the benefits. So IUCN membership is actually open to, the uniqueness about IUCN membership is that it's open to a diverse range of stakeholders. So we bring together state members, we bring together NGOs, we bring together both local and international, we bring together indigenous people organizations and academic institutions. So you realize that when it comes to, influencing, sharing, knowledge and, different, whether it's achievements or lessons learned, then we're speaking to a very wide range of stakeholders. Globally, we have about 1,300 membership organizations across about 170 countries. And we also ride on the fact that beyond being IUCN members as organizations, individuals also become members of our IUCN commissions. So the members of IUCN commissions are actually volunteers. And people like Holly, for example, is a member of the IUCN commission, and you get value from the diverse knowledge that you get from these members of the IUCN commission. And there are 6 of them, and you can read more about them. I already talked about the different category of members that we have. Just to narrow down to East and Southern Africa, we currently have about 103 members, and that's a combination of state members, indigenous people organizations, NGOs, and the range that I talked about. And just in Ezaro alone, we have over 900 commission members as well. I spoke about the benefits of being a member. We talk about influencing, so you are able to actually influence at a higher level. We also bring together collective voices. So say, for example, the initiative that we're talking about today, we are actually able to speak together, but we are not directly implementing. You're hearing it from people like Dixon, for example, who have actually worked with the communities and they are bringing their voices on board. So when you're a member, you actually ride on a vast platform. We talk about partnerships and networking. We bring people together, like you see, for example, working with the Africa Biodiversity Group. You're actually able to bring together different partners. So you do a lot of networking and you get to learn more. You get a lot of knowledge as well, capacity building at the same time, and then that way I'm sure we are actually able to all achieve what? A world in which we are able to actually conserve nature together, isn't it? So that's it from me. Together we work on a one program approach, and this is a very good example. We don't work alone, we work with a diverse range of members, and we do work together to actually draft the program and implement it. So the IUCN program is not just drafted with IUCN alone, it's together with all the members. So something to think about, and you can read more about our membership on the website, and we can talk about it more. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. And yeah, so there's some snacks and drinks. Feel free to mingle and talk to any of us over the time.